You're not going to believe what I'm about to tell you, but I need to get this story out there. What happened to me and my crew last October still haunts me every single day. I'm a helicopter pilot for mountain rescue operations, and I've flown hundreds of missions without anything stranger than spotting the occasional bear. But everything changed on a day that should have been just another routine call. It was one of those perfect October days in the mountains. Blue skies, crisp air, the kind of weather that makes you grateful to be a pilot. Temperatures hovered around 60 degrees, with barely a breeze. Flying conditions couldn't have been better. Below me, the forest stretched out in a sea of red and gold as the leaves turned, looking like a massive quilt laid across the earth. From 3,000 feet up, it all seemed so peaceful, just endless, untouched wilderness rolling toward the horizon. I'd been flying rescues in these mountains for 12 years. I thought I'd seen it all: bear attacks, avalanche victims, hunters who'd gotten themselves lost, hikers with heart attacks on remote trails. The mountains can be brutal, but they're predictable. Follow the protocols, trust your equipment, get people out alive. It's dangerous work, but it makes sense. Around noon, while I was running routine maintenance checks on the chopper, we got the call. 2 hikers had been missing for 3 days in a remote section of national forest, about 40 miles northeast of the nearest ranger station. Their families had reported them overdue, and since then, ground teams had been combing the area, tracking every sign, checking every campsite. The obvious spots had all been covered: the marked trails, the usual camping areas, the places where lost hikers normally turn up. But these 2 were simply gone. No trace at their intended campsite. No signal from their emergency beacons. No response to overflights or ground crews shouting their names. It was like the forest had swallowed them whole. The breakthrough came on day 3, when 2 veteran rangers guys with over 20 years of mountain experience each decided to push into some of the most remote country out there. It was the kind of terrain no casual hiker should have been anywhere near, but sometimes people wander further than they should. These rangers knew every ridge, every creek, every hunting trail across hundreds of square miles of wilderness. They found the missing hikers 15 miles from the nearest marked trail, in such an isolated patch of forest it didn't even show up on most topo maps. The only way in was by helicopter or a 2-day trek across rugged, pathless terrain that demanded serious mountaineering skills. How those 2 recreational hikers ended up there is still a mystery. When the rangers radioed in their location, the news was mixed. Both hikers were alive, but one had a badly broken leg, a compound fracture that had already turned septic after 3 days in the wild. The other was in shock, dehydrated, but still able to move. Time was critical for the injured one. Without immediate medical attention, he could lose the leg, or worse. The coordinates the rangers relayed were deep inside what we call the dead zone areas, so remote that cell service is non-existent, and even radio contact fades in and out. The terrain was brutal: thick, old-growth forest, split by steep ravines and jagged cliffs, the kind of place where a helicopter crash might never be found, the kind of place people vanish without a trace. That day, my crew was rock solid. My hoist operator had 8 years of mountain rescue under his belt. He was the kind of guy who could thread a cable in 30-mile-an-hour winds, never rattled, never complaining, with an intuitive grasp of aircraft systems that let him troubleshoot mid-air issues most operators wouldn't touch. Our medic was newer to the team, but she had impressive credentials. Before moving to the mountains, she'd worked as an ER doctor in Detroit, handling everything from gunshot wounds to overdoses. Fresh out of advanced wilderness medicine training, she was eager to prove herself on tough rescues. She had this calm presence that worked wonders on panicked patients, and she never let the remoteness of a scene shake her. In just 6 months together, we'd already pulled off dozens of rescues, heart attacks on mountain peaks, hypothermia victims hauled out of freezing rivers. Our success rate was nearly flawless, and we'd developed that unspoken communication that only comes from absolute trust in your team. Still, those coordinates were further out than we usually went. Looking at the maps, I realized we'd be flying over country that hadn't been surveyed in decades, maybe ever. No roads, no power lines, no cell towers, just uninterrupted wilderness stretching for miles in every direction. As we lifted off and headed toward the mountains, I ran fuel calculations in my head, double-checking the weather patterns. The forecast looked clear for the next 4 hours, but mountain weather can turn in minutes, and we'd be operating right at the edge of our fuel range. If something went wrong, if the search took longer than planned, we might not have enough fuel to make it back. The first 20 minutes of the flight took us over familiar ground. I could see the patchwork of logging roads below, scattered clear cuts, and replanted areas forming rough squares on the lower slopes. Thin, brown hiking trails traced lines through the green, and sunlight from the mountain ridges would occasionally spill down onto those high country highways. But as we climbed higher and pushed deeper into the range, all of that fell away. The forest below began to look different, older, darker, more crowded. We were well and truly beyond civilization. This was old-growth country, the kind of forest that had existed for centuries. The trees were so massive that, from our altitude, their trunks looked like columns. Their canopies were thick and even, forming what looked like a green carpet stretching to the horizon. The foliage was so dense I could barely make out gaps. Every now and then I caught a flash of a stream or an exposed rock outcrop, but mostly it was an endless sea of green. I wondered how anyone could survive if they got lost here. The forest looked impenetrable, hostile to human life. Those two hikers had been lucky the rangers found them. While my hoist operator was checking his gear, I noticed something that set my nerves on edge. We were flying over a stand of trees that looked different. Taller, darker, packed in, tighter. There weren't any visible clearings, no breaks in the canopy at all, like looking down at a solid wall of vegetation that had never been touched by human hands. Our medic leaned forward from the back and commented on how dense the forest looked. She told me the rangers had mentioned finding what looked like some kind of game trail, maybe an animal track that the hikers had apparently followed once they became disoriented. I nodded, but something about the whole situation bothered me. Experienced recreational hikers don't usually wander that far off course by accident. The timeline didn't add up. By their planned route, they shouldn't have been anywhere near where the rangers found them. It was as if something had pulled them 15 miles off their intended path. As we closed on the coordinates, I began scanning for a gap or a place we could get close enough to perform a hoist. The GPS showed we were still about 8 miles out when I caught the first glimpse of what we were up against. The terrain below was even more brutal than the map suggested: sheer ravines, knife-edged cliffs, and unbroken ancient canopy. While I was working to orient the aircraft, something moved in the trees off to the left of our flight path, in my peripheral vision. At first, I thought it might be a deer or an elk. We often saw wildlife from the air, but whatever it was looked too large and its movement felt off. I tilted for a closer look, but whatever it had been was gone. Only that endless green remained. The hoist operator noticed the change in my heading and asked if I'd seen anything. I told him I thought I'd seen an animal, maybe an elk. Even as I said it, I wasn't convinced. What I'd glimpsed was moving through the giant trunks with an almost deliberate purpose. It was huge, larger than an elk, bigger than any animal I'd expect to see in these mountains. About 5 miles from the target coordinates, I saw it again. This time it was more visible through a break in the canopy, something dark and massive cutting through the forest, moving roughly parallel to our flight path. It seemed to be keeping pace with us, which was strange. Most wildlife freezes at the sound of a helicopter or else bolts. This thing matched our speed and heading as if it were following us. I tried to point it out to the others, but by the time they looked, whatever had been there had vanished. The hoist operator asked me what I'd seen. I described something very large moving through the trees, keeping up with us. The medic suggested it might be a bear, noting bears can move surprisingly fast when they want to. I nodded, but I'd seen plenty of bears from the air, and this didn't move like a bear. Bears have a heavy, rolling gait when they run. What I'd seen moved more upright, with a purposeful stride almost human, but far too large to be a person. About 3 miles out, the forest began to thin a little. I could make out patches of exposed rock and small clearings now and then. The GPS showed we were closing on the coordinates, and I started scanning for any place we could set down or at least get close enough to perform a hoist. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time. It was standing in a small clearing about 2 miles from our position. Even from that distance, I could tell it was huge, roughly 8 feet tall and covered in dark fur, with proportions that were almost human but not quite. The shoulders were too broad, the arms too long, and it was staring right at us. I pulled the helicopter back to gain altitude and asked if the others could see what I was pointing at. Both crew members leaned forward, trying to pick out what I'd indicated, but by the time they had a clear view, the thing had melted back into the trees, gone as fast as it had appeared. The hoist operator asked what the hell that was. I admitted I didn't know, only that it was watching us. The medic tried to rationalize what we'd seen, suggesting it might be a person, maybe another search team. Even as she said it, I heard doubt in her voice. Nobody that size, and nobody would be out there in that area anyway. The Rangers had made it clear they were the only ground teams in the sector. As we drew nearer to the coordinates, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every dark patch in the forest below seemed to hide something. Every gap in the canopy felt like it could reveal more of whatever was down there. My neck prickled, and I found myself double-checking fuel and escape routes. The GPS showed we were within a quarter mile of the target when I finally spotted what looked like a small clearing up ahead. It wasn't large, maybe 50 feet across, with a few scattered trees, but it sat on higher ground and looked like our best option for a hoist. As we closed, I could make out 4 figures waving frantically. We came in closer, and the group resolved. 2 rangers in Forest Service uniforms standing by what looked like a makeshift landing cleared of branches and rocks. A wounded hiker on a field stretcher fashioned from branches and emergency blankets, and another civilian, likely the injured man's hiking partner, wrapped in a space blanket and sitting nearby, clearly alert and on edge. Even at 50 feet, I could tell something was off about the scene. The rangers looked tense, constantly watching the trees around the clearing. The uninjured hiker was doing the same, head swiveling as if expecting something to emerge from the woods at any second. The man on the stretcher was trying to sit up despite the broken leg, wildly gesturing toward the tree line. Hovering was tricky in that uneven, tree-choked terrain, but I held steady while the hoist operator prepared the rig. We'd done this hundreds of times, but there was something different about this rescue, an urgency in the rescuer's movements that went beyond the medical emergency. The plan was simple: get the injured hiker first, then the others one at a time. The medic had her kit ready to assess him the moment he hit the cabin. We lowered the basket and brought the wounded man up without incident. As the hoist operator lifted him, I could hear him speaking not the usual groans or cries of pain, but rapid, panicked speech. Once the stretcher was secured under the helicopter, the medic immediately began checking his vitals and examining the infected leg. He was conscious, but clearly in bad shape, pale, sweating, feverish from the infection. What struck me most was the look of terror on his face. Not fear of pain, but pure, bone-deep terror, like he'd seen something that had utterly shattered him. He kept saying they couldn't stay, that something was still out there watching them right now. Over the thump of the rotors, I could make out broken, feverish fragments of what he was trying to tell the medic about something he'd encountered in the woods. Between clipped, halting sentences, I heard him describe something 8 feet tall, towering, walking almost like a man, with eyes unlike anything he'd ever seen. He insisted it had been stalking them. The medic continued working on his leg, but I could see her exchanging a look with the hoist operator. We'd dealt with hallucinations before. Lost people in the backcountry sometimes become hypothermic or dehydrated and start to see things. But this guy was too lucid, his descriptions too specific. As we prepared to lower the basket for the next pickup, the wounded man suddenly grabbed the medic's arm with surprising strength. He forced her to listen. His partner down below had seen it too, both of them had. 3 nights earlier, it had come to their camp and stood at the edge of the fire, watching them. When they'd shone flashlights at it, it made a sound like nothing they could identify. Not exactly human, not exactly animal, something between. And intelligent. You could see it thinking, he kept saying, deciding what to do with us. The hoist operator lowered the basket again, and the uninjured hiker climbed in. As we lifted him, his face mirrored the same raw, hollow terror as his friends. As soon as he was aboard, he started talking, confirming everything the injured man had said. He insisted we get them out of there right away, that the thing was still down in the trees and had been watching them since they got lost. The Rangers had found them just in time, he said. He didn't think they would have survived much longer. Another night. This hiker was in better shape than his friend, just dehydrated and exhausted, but the terror in his eyes was the same. His hands trembled as he described what they'd been through. The first night, they thought it was just a bear coming into camp. But bears don't stand upright for 10 minutes just watching. And bears don't leave footprints that look human, twice the size of ours. The medic asked if they had taken any photos or video. The uninjured hiker shook his head. Their phones had died on the second day, but he admitted that even if the batteries had lasted, he wouldn't have dared to pull one out. When it looked at you, he whispered, it felt like it was staring straight through you, like it was deciding whether or not to kill you. His injured friend nodded weakly in agreement. They believed the creature could have ended their lives at any moment, and it wasn't in a hurry. It was toying with them, like a cat with a mouse. The second night, it came closer. They heard heavy footsteps circling just beyond the firelight, pacing around the camp, making deep, rumbling sounds like it was speaking. The winch operator frowned. You mean there was more than one? The hiker nodded, lowering his voice. At least two. They talked to each other, not like animals, more like people speaking in some strange language we couldn't understand. By the third night, the injured man was delirious with fever, but the other kept watch, wide awake. His voice cracked as he told us he'd seen at least 3, maybe 4 figures. They stood at the edge of the light, just watching. One was much larger than the rest, towering above them, clearly the leader. When he threw more wood on the fire, they slipped back into the trees, but he knew they hadn't gone far. The medic stayed skeptical, insisting the men were simply dehydrated, stressed, hallucinating. But the hiker pressed on. We know what we saw. One more night out there, and we'd be dead. We got a ranger on board the chopper. I asked him about the hiker's fear, what could have spooked them so badly. He shook his head, saying they hadn't stopped talking about some kind of monster in the woods since they were found. In his opinion, it was just exhaustion playing tricks on their minds. Maybe they ran into a bear or a mountain lion, and fear twisted it into something else. But then I saw it, something massive moving in the trees closer than ever before, less than 100 yards out. I pointed it out, asked the ranger if there was anyone else out there. He shook his head. No, just those 4. But I knew I wasn't imagining things. And then it stepped out. From behind a massive pine, the figure emerged, towering over the brush, staring straight at us. I had never seen anything like it. At least 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair. Its body was half man, half beast. In one hand, it held a huge black shape, a boulder the size of a basketball. I shouted, pointing. The ranger took one look and screamed, "Get us out of here now!" But one man was still on the ground below, the cable dangling. The creature raised its massive arm, ready to throw. Everything slowed. I saw the rock leave its hand. I yanked hard on the controls, trying to veer off, but the winch line held us down. The crash of the impact was deafening as the boulder slammed into the tail boom. The chopper shuddered violently, spinning out. The controls went limp. We were dropping fast, spiraling. I screamed at everyone to brace for impact. Below us, the treetops rushed up to meet us. The last thing I remember was the medic's scream and the sound of metal tearing apart as the rotor blades chewed through the canopy. Then everything went black. We were wasting precious time and energy, and I grew more and more worried about whether we could find an exit before nightfall. The medic staggered and fell for the 3rd time, scraping her uninjured arm on a jagged rock. When I helped her up, I could feel how hot she was. The fever was getting worse, and she began showing signs of a serious head injury. Dilated pupils, confusion, trouble coordinating her movements. She said she needed to rest for a few minutes. I wanted to keep moving, but she didn't have the strength to go on. We found a spot where a fallen tree had created a natural shelter, and I made her as comfortable as I could. The silence around us was suffocating. No bird song, no insects, only the occasional whisper of a stream through the high branches above. That's when I heard the first footsteps. Heavy and deliberate, not the random crash of a deer or the padding of a bear. Something huge was moving in the woods about 50 yards away, keeping pace with us. I held my breath and tried to pinpoint the exact direction. Step, another step. Whatever was out there was walking straight, taking even human-like strides. But the distance between steps was too long and the impact too powerful. This was something bigger than any man. The medic heard it too. Her eyes widened with terror, and she pressed herself against the fallen trunk, as if trying to disappear into the bark. She whispered that it had found us. The footsteps stopped. The forest went completely silent. No wind, no rustle of leaves, nothing. It was listening, trying to locate us precisely. I could feel eyes on us even though I couldn't see through the dense undergrowth. Then a sound came that made my heart nearly stop. A low, querying call, almost like a human voice but twisted, as if someone were speaking with a mouth full of gravel. It came from just ahead of us, maybe 30 yards out. Another voice answered from our left, then a third from behind. We were surrounded. I grabbed the medic's good arm and helped her to her feet. We couldn't stay there any longer. We moved very slowly, slipping through the underbrush, trying to put distance between us and whatever was stalking us. But they followed easily. Every few steps I'd hear a branch snap or leaves rustle, something massive moving parallel to our path. They weren't trying to be stealthy anymore. They wanted us to know we were being hunted. The chase went on for what felt like hours. We'd find a hiding spot, hold our breath, and the sounds would fade until we thought we were safe. Then we'd start moving again, and within minutes hear them behind us once more. By then, the medic was barely conscious. The combination of her injuries and the terror had pushed her past the limit. I was basically carrying her, and our pace slowed to a crawl. I knew we couldn't outrun them. Our only hope was to find a defensible position and wait for dawn. As darkness closed in, I found a cluster of boulders that formed a small cave-like overhang. I helped the medic inside and did what I could to make her comfortable. She was shaking despite the warm October air, likely shock and blood loss. She asked me if we were going to die. I had no answer. Our situation couldn't have been worse. We were deep in hostile country, both injured, with no way to call for help and no weapons to defend ourselves. And somewhere out in the darkness surrounding us, things that should not exist were hunting. That was when we heard them again. Footsteps in the forest around us, but this time different. More deliberate, more organized. They were working together, coordinating their movements like a military unit sweeping an area. We held our breath and tried to stay silent. The footsteps drew closer, then faded, only to return from another direction. They were methodically dividing the ground, checking every possible hiding place. And each pass brought them closer to where we lay. At one point, something came so near to our shelter that I could smell it. That wild, musky odor clung to the air around these creatures. I heard a sound like sniffing, as though it was trying to catch our scent. The medic pressed her face into my shoulder to muffle any noise. They were communicating too low, whoops, strange chatter-like murmurs drifting from different directions. I counted at least 4 distinct voices, maybe more. We weren't dealing with just one of these things. This was a coordinated hunt. The pattern went on for hours. Each time we thought they'd finally given up and moved on, the footsteps would return, closer than before. They knew we were in the area, and they weren't going to stop until they found us. Around midnight, the medic slipped into unconsciousness. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her skin burning with fever. I knew she needed urgent medical care, but all I could do was keep her warm and pray she made it through the night. Sometime around 3 a.m, I heard something that froze the blood in my veins. One of them had found our trail. I could hear it following the exact path we'd taken through the forest, moving steadily toward our hiding place. The footsteps stopped just outside the little cave. I could hear its breathing deep, slow, unhurried. Whatever was out there was standing only a few feet away, maybe confirming that we were inside. A massive shadow slid across the narrow crack of starlight filtering through the branches overhead. I held the medic as still as I could and tried not to breathe. My heart pounded so hard I was certain it could hear it. We stayed frozen like that for what felt like forever. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the shadow moved on and the footsteps faded past our shelter. But I knew it would be back. They all would. They were patient, systematic, and they had the whole night to find us. Our hiding spot was good but not perfect. Sooner or later, one of them would think to check inside the rocks. As dawn crept in, the forest slowly came back to life. Birdsong returned, squirrels chattered in the branches above. The suffocating silence of the night lifted, and with it the creatures seemed to fade into the shadows. I waited until full daylight before daring to move. The medic was still unconscious, and her condition was clearly worsening. Her pulse was weak but steady. She needed a hospital immediately, but first, I had to figure out we had to find a way out of this forest alive. As the first light broke through the canopy, I heard them again. They were back. This time, the footsteps were closer, more deliberate. They had found us. Through the brush, about 40 yards away, I caught sight of one of them. It was huge, bigger even than the one that had taken down our helicopter. This one was nearly pitch black, with massive shoulders and arms that almost dragged the ground. Its face was partly hidden, visible only through the morning mist. Not entirely human, not entirely ape, something unsettling in between. It moved with purpose through the trees, stopping every few steps to sniff the air, examine the ground, tracking us. This wasn't a random search. It knew exactly what it was hunting. The medic made a tiny sound, barely more than a breath, but in the silence of the forest, it may as well have been a scream. The creature's head snapped toward us, its eyes locking on our hiding place. For a moment, we stared at each other across the forest floor, predator and prey. And then I made a decision that still haunts me. The nurse was already dying, and if I stayed, both of us would be taken. I whispered an apology, kissed her forehead, and slid out from beneath the fallen tree, moving as silently as I could in the opposite direction of the advancing beast. Behind me, I heard heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush as it lunged toward where we'd been hiding. Then the nurse screamed a sound I'll never forget, raw with pain, terror, and the sudden realization of death. Her scream cut off abruptly, replaced by noises I will not describe. I ran, even with a broken leg, even with the pain tearing through me. Every step felt like it split me in two, but I ran like my life depended on it because it did. Behind me, I could hear the creature calling out, summoning the others. Their voices echoed through the trees, hoarse, almost human-like sounds. More footsteps joined the pursuit, crashing through the forest without any attempt at stealth. Now they were openly chasing me, and I knew with horrifying certainty that they were faster. My only advantage was my smaller size. I could squeeze through brush and gaps that might slow them down. The next hour was pure survival instinct. I plowed through thorn thickets that shredded my clothes and tore my skin, tumbled down rocky slopes, dragging myself back up. Did everything I could think of to throw off my trail, wading through streams to mask my scent, doubling back, hiding in brush as they passed dangerously close. The sounds of pursuit slowly faded, but I didn't stop running. Every shadow could be one of them. Every fallen log could be an ambush. The forest itself felt hostile now, as if even the trees wanted me dead. My broken leg throbbed, but adrenaline kept me moving. I fashioned a crude splint from a straight branch and a strip of my shirt, then forced myself onward. Stopping meant death, and I had seen what that looked like. The terrain fought me at every step. What should have been a simple trek through the forest became an obstacle course. Fallen trees, steep ravines, tangles of brush that clawed at me. I was leaving a clear trail, but I didn't have time to be careful. As the morning wore on, the forest began to change. The oppressive sense of being hunted started to lift. Normal forest sounds returned, birds calling, squirrels chattering in the branches, insects buzzing around my head, signs that I might be moving out of their territory. I stumbled across a small stream and followed it downhill, hoping it would lead to a larger river or maybe even a road. The icy water cleared my head, washed away some of the blood and grime from my desperate flight. It turned out to be the right choice. After another grueling hour of limping, staggering, sometimes crawling when the pain became unbearable, I began to see signs of humanity again. First, an old burn scar carved into a tree, faded but unmistakably man-made. Then, rusted wire remnants of an ancient fence line. The forest was changing. The ancient giants that dominated the landscape where we'd gone down were giving way to younger trees, old growth that had once been logged in the distant past. The understory was different now. Airier, less oppressive, less of that constant feeling of being watched from the dark. Still, I didn't want to take chances. I stayed in the stream as long as I could, hoping the running water would mask my scent and make it harder for whatever might be tracking me. Every few hundred yards, I'd stop and listen for signs of pursuit, but the forest around me seemed normal. The creatures, whatever they were, appeared to have abandoned the chase. Or maybe I'd simply left their territory. As the day wore on, the creek widened and deepened. I could hear the water getting louder ahead, rapids, maybe a waterfall. That was a good sign. Fast water meant a change in elevation, and a change in elevation could mean I was getting close to the edge of the mountains. When I reached the sound, I found a series of falls tumbling down a rocky slope. The water was loud enough to mask any noise I might make. More important, carved into one of the rocks beside the largest pool were initials and dates, clear evidence that others had been here before. I picked my way down beside the falls, using exposed roots and rocks as handholds. The descent was treacherous on my wounded leg. I slipped more than once, but the promise of rescue kept me moving. Below the falls, the stream fed into a larger creek, flowing toward what looked like a real valley. I could see open sky ahead through thinning canopy. For the first time since the crash, I allowed myself to believe I might survive this. The larger creek had a trail running alongside it, not just game tracks, but old human footprints pressed into the mud. Hunters, fishermen, hikers who'd found their way back here for years. I was heading the right way. 2 hours later, exhausted and barely able to put weight on my broken leg, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world: distant traffic, cars and trucks on a highway. The background noise of civilization, something I hadn't realized how much I'd need until that moment. I pushed through the last stand of trees on my makeshift crutch in raw determination and almost collapsed with relief when I saw a paved road stretching both directions. It was a 2-lane mountain highway that connected remote communities across these hills. I could see fresh tire tracks on the gravel shoulder. People used this road regularly. I only had to wait for the right vehicle to come by. I didn't wait long. Within 10 minutes, I heard the rumble of a diesel engine coming from the south. A pickup rounded the bend, and I stumbled out onto the road, waving like a madman. The driver, an older local farmer in his 60s, saw me and knew at a glance that something terrible had happened. He helped me into the passenger seat and immediately grabbed his cell phone to call for help. I tried to tell him that our mountain rescue helicopter had crashed, that 3 people were dead, and I was the pilot. He didn't ask questions. He just called and started driving to the nearest hospital. Within minutes, I could hear sirens in the distance. Ambulance, fire truck, probably police. Rescue had begun. The next few hours blur into a haze of ER rooms, doctors, investigators' questions, and phone calls to notify families. I was treated for a broken leg, multiple lacerations, severe dehydration, and what the doctors called an acute stress reaction. They sedated me through the first day while they cleaned and stabilized my wounds. When I was finally lucid enough to give a statement, I told the investigators what they needed to hear. Our helicopter had suffered a mechanical failure during a routine rescue. We'd gone down in a remote area, and I was the sole survivor. The others had died on impact. Search teams found the wreckage 2 days later, exactly where I'd said. They confirmed the winch operator, the ranger, and the injured hiker were dead, their bodies still entangled with the aircraft, but despite an extensive search of the crash site, they never found the medic's body. The official explanation suggested she was thrown clear in the impact, and her remains were scattered by scavengers. They also never found the ranger who had been on the ground with the hikers when we went down. According to the formal investigation, there was no evidence anyone else had been at the scene. That ranger we'd rescued corroborated my account of the mission, but he claimed his companion walked out on his own after the crash. No one ever found him either. Investigators focused on mechanical failure and pilot error. They discovered stress fractures in the tail rotor assembly that could have produced a catastrophic failure under the right conditions. Combined with the challenging terrain and my relatively limited hours on that specific airframe, it made for a plausible accident report. There was no mention of giant rocks hurled by impossible creatures. The victims' families deserved answers, but how could I tell them the truth? How could I tell the winch operator's wife that her husband had been killed by something that shouldn't exist? How could I tell the injured hiker's parents that their son died because we flew into the territory of creatures that regarded us as invaders? I stayed silent about what had really happened for months. The nightmares came every night, reliving the moment the rock hit our helicopter, hearing the hoist operator's final scream, running through that black forest while impossible things chased me. I started drinking to sleep, then drinking to make it through the day. My marriage fell apart. I lost my pilot's license while undergoing psychiatric evaluation. Eventually, I had to tell someone. The weight of this secret was destroying what was left of my life. I started with my brother. He listened without judgment and believed every word. Then a few close friends and fellow pilots, other rescuers who'd heard odd stories from remote corners for years. What I found was frightening. I wasn't alone. There were other pilots, rescuers, hunters, hikers, and Forest Service personnel who'd encountered things in the deep wilderness they couldn't explain. Most never told their stories, afraid of being dismissed as crazy or losing their jobs. Gradually, a picture emerged. A creature or creatures living in the most remote parts of this mountain range, intelligent, territorial, and dangerous. The local people had legends going back centuries about giants in the woods that protected the deep wild from human intrusion. Maybe those stories weren't pure myth. The investigation closed 6 months later. Metal fatigue, pilot error, and extreme operating conditions. The case was closed. The wreckage was recovered and sent to a federal facility for analysis, then quietly disposed of. The crash site was marked on aviation charts as a hazardous area, but no further flight restrictions were imposed. But something had changed in me. I'd learned there are places on this planet where humans aren't welcome, where ancient intelligences still rule. We had stumbled into their domain with noise and machines, and they had defended their territory in the only way they knew. I never flew again. Every time I came near a helicopter, panic would set in, sweating, shortness of breath, flashbacks of those final moments. The doctors called it PTSD, and maybe that explained part of it. But mostly, I couldn't bear the idea of going back into those mountains and possibly running into one of those creatures. The medic deserved better. She was 28, bright, dedicated, with her whole life ahead of her. She joined our team because she wanted to save lives and make a difference. Instead, she died alone and terrified in a forest that had no room for human compassion. The winch operator was 6 months from retirement, 20 years of rescue missions, hundreds of lives saved, and it all ended because we flew into the wrong valley on the wrong day. At his funeral, his kids asked me what his last words had been. I told them he'd said he loved them. It wasn't true, but it sounded kinder than the truth. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed with the medic, if there was more I could have done. Deep down, I know that if I'd stayed, both of us would have died, and no one would ever have known what really happened. At least I lived to tell the story, to warn others about what's out there in those deep forests. I spent years researching similar incidents, looking for patterns in unexplained disappearances and mysterious aircraft accidents in remote wilderness. What I found was disturbing. There are dozens of cases every year. Hikers vanishing without a trace, hunters who never return from solo trips, small planes going down under baffling circumstances in places they shouldn't have been flying. Government agencies responsible for investigating these incidents always find ordinary explanations: equipment failure, human error, environmental causes, and those explanations are often technically plausible. Environmental factors. That's what the official reports always say. But when you start looking at the data as a whole, patterns emerge that point to something else going on. Remote regions with a history of indigenous legends about giants in the forest show statistically higher rates of unexplained disappearances. Aircraft crashes in those areas often involve sudden catastrophic failures that investigators struggle to explain, and survivors often report seeing large bipedal creatures nearby. Those reports usually get dismissed as trauma-induced hallucinations. I'm not the only one who's noticed these patterns. There's a small community of researchers mostly operating outside official channels who document these incidents and try to piece together what's really happening out in our most remote wilderness. We share information, compare notes, and try to warn people about the dangers they might face in certain places. But it's an uphill fight. The official explanations are always easier to swallow than the truth. People want to believe our national parks and wilderness areas are safe, that modern technology and emergency protocols can protect us anywhere we choose to go. The idea that there are places where the old rules still apply, where human intelligence and equipment mean nothing, challenges everything we assume about our place in the natural world. The hardest part is the not knowing. Are there more of them? How many? What do they want? Are they simply protecting territory or eliminating threats? I replay those last moments before the crash over and over, wondering if there was some way to communicate, some way to show we meant no harm. But then I remember the medic's scream, and I know, whatever they are, they saw us as enemies. Maybe they always have, ever since the first humans carved into their territory with roads, towns, and aircraft. Maybe helicopters represent everything they despise about our world: the noise, the pollution, the violation of their ancient homeland. I still live in that town, though I moved down from the mountains into a house in the valley. Sometimes, when I'm driving the back roads at night and see dark shapes shifting between the trees, I don't stop to investigate. I just keep driving, trying not to think about what might be watching me from the shadows. The official reports will never tell the truth about what happened that October. 3 good people died because we flew into territory we didn't understand. carrying the very technology that marked us as invaders. The creatures that attacked us were protecting their home the only way they knew how. I survived by abandoning my friends and running. That wasn't heroism, and it sure wasn't noble. That's just what happened. But I'm the only one left alive who knows the truth about what lives in those deep forests. The sole witness to an encounter the government refuses to acknowledge. That's why I'm telling this story, because people need to know. If you plan to explore the backcountry, if you're heading into places with no trails and no cell towers, understand this: you may not be alone. Something out there has been watching us for a very long time, and it doesn't like visitors. Listen for the sounds that don't belong, the footsteps that are too heavy, the calls that don't match any animal you know. Pay attention to movement in your peripheral vision, shadows that seem too big or too deliberate. And if you ever see something that looks almost human but not quite right, don't get closer. Don't try to communicate. Leave as quickly and quietly as you can. Because next time, you may not be as lucky as I was. Next time, there may be no one left to tell the story. That was 5 years ago. 5 years since I lost my crew. Since I ran through that nightmare forest with things that shouldn't exist hunting me like prey. 5 years of sleepless nights, therapy sessions that went nowhere because I couldn't tell the truth, and watching my life fall apart piece by piece. The drinking got worse before it got better. There were months I couldn't leave the house without panic attacks. Every tall tree reminded me of the canopy. Every shadow looked like it was hiding something massive and hostile. My wife left me after 18 months of watching me drink myself unconscious, then wake screaming from nightmares I couldn't explain. But something changed about 2 years ago. I was at rock bottom, living alone in a trailer park, when I got a call from someone who had heard my story through a network of people who know what's really happening out there. He was a retired ranger who'd had his own encounter 20 years earlier. Different location, same beings, same intelligence, same territorial behavior that most people refuse to believe exists. He told me about others, dozens of them scattered across the country, survivors of encounters, witnesses to attacks, people who lost friends and family to things that can't officially be acknowledged. We started meeting, sharing information, trying to piece together a bigger picture. What we discovered was both terrifying and fascinating. These beings aren't random monsters. They're organized, intelligent, and they've been systematically protecting their territory for decades, maybe centuries. The wilderness areas where encounters are most frequent form a pattern, ancient corridors of forest that were never logged or heavily exploited. We started calling them protected zones, areas where human activity is tolerated only at the edges, where deeper intrusion is met with increasingly aggressive responses. The most disturbing discovery wasn't about the creatures themselves, it was about how effectively they've been covered up. Government agencies, forestry services, aviation authorities, they all have procedures for handling these incidents. Reports get filed, then buried. Witnesses are questioned, then relocated or quietly dismissed. Physical evidence disappears into classified archives. And the official explanations are always the same: equipment failure, human error, natural causes. But we've been keeping our own records. Photos, testimonies, physical evidence when we can get it, building a database of encounters spanning generations. What we've seen is alarming. Activity is increasing. More sightings, more aggressive encounters, more people disappearing in areas that used to be relatively safe. Something is shifting in their behavior. Maybe it's pressure from human expansion into their territory. Maybe climate change is altering their habitat. Or maybe they've just grown tired of hiding and decided to act more directly in defending what they see as theirs. 3 months ago, I got the call I'd been dreading. Another helicopter went down almost in the exact same area where my crew was killed. Search and rescue mission. Experienced pilot. Perfect weather conditions. The wreckage was scattered across a wide area, as if the aircraft had been ripped apart mid-air. No survivors, no clear cause. But one of the search team found something the official investigators missed: a massive footprint pressed into the soft earth near the main debris field. He photographed it before anyone else arrived, then quietly passed the image through our network. It was identical to the tracks I saw 5 years earlier. They're still out there, still guarding their territory, still killing anyone who gets too close to whatever it is they're protecting deep in those ancient forests. I testified at the official hearing for that crash, sticking to the approved narrative of mechanical failure and adverse conditions. But afterward, I went to see the pilot's widow. I told her I understood her loss in a way most people never could. I gave her my contact information and told her that if she ever wanted to know the truth about what happened to her husband, she should call me. 2 weeks later, she did. At first, she didn't believe me. Who would? But when I showed her the evidence we've collected, the patterns in the data, the testimonies of dozens of witnesses, she began to understand. Now she's helping us, using her husband's insurance payout to fund our research and support other families who've lost loved ones to these beings. We're not trying to prove they exist. We already know they do. We're trying to understand them, what they want, and whether there's any way to coexist that doesn't mean more people dying. But I'm not optimistic. These creatures have been here longer than us. They remember when these mountains were theirs without question, before roads, before cities, before helicopters carved up their world. From their perspective, we're the invaders. We don't belong here, and maybe they're right. I still dream about that October, about the medic's scream, about running through the forest with those hollow footsteps pounding after me. Sometimes I dream about what might have happened if I'd stayed with her, if I'd tried to fight instead of running. In those dreams, I usually die. But at least in those versions, I don't carry the guilt of leaving her behind. Survivor's guilt never fades. Knowing there are places in this world where human technology, human intelligence, human determination mean absolutely nothing that changes you. Places where the old rules still apply, where we're just another species struggling to survive in lands we don't understand. People sometimes ask me if I regret becoming a pilot, if I wish I'd chosen a safer career. The answer's complicated. Flying gave me some of the greatest experiences of my life, and also the worst. It showed me the beauty of the mountains from above, and the horror of what hides in their shadows. But mostly I think of the families, the ones who lost loved ones to these beings and never got answers, never found closure. Official reports blame mechanical failures or pilot error for deaths that were, in reality, caused by intelligent predators defending their territory. Children grow up wondering why their father never came home from a routine rescue mission. That's why I keep telling this story. Even if most people think I'm crazy, even if it cost me my marriage, my career, my reputation, because someone has to remember what really happened. Someone has to bear witness to the truth, that we share this planet with an intelligence older, stronger, and far less merciful than our own. And someone has to warn the rest of you about what's still out there waiting in the deep forests, in the uncharted mountains. Because the next time you plan an adventure into true wilderness, the next time you tell yourself modern gear and emergency procedures will keep you safe no matter where you go, I want you to remember this story. Remember that there are things out there that have been watching us for a very long time. Things that see our presence as an invasion, our technology as a threat. Things that will defend their territory with a level of intelligence and coordination we're only beginning to understand. The crash 3 months ago was just the latest in a chain stretching back generations. It won't be the last. As long as humans keep pushing into places we don't belong, so long as we keep assuming nature is ours to dominate, these encounters will continue. And every time, the official explanation will be the same. Equipment failure, human error, natural causes. Families will be told their loved ones died in tragic but explainable accidents. The truth will be buried in classified files and bureaucratic indifference. But we'll keep recording, keep collecting evidence, keep trying to understand what we're really up against out there in the wild. Because someday, the pattern will become too obvious to ignore. Someday, the truth won't be deniable. Until then, all I can do is tell the story and hope someone out there listens. Hope they understand that the next time they venture deep into the wilderness, they may not be alone and they may not come back. The creatures that killed my crew are still out there, still watching, still waiting, and they have all the time in the world. The creatures seem to have a hierarchy, with larger, more intelligent individuals directing the actions of smaller groups. They use tools, plan coordinated attacks, and demonstrate a deep understanding of human behavior and technology.